Welcome to Lecture 16 of Applied Machine Learning. In Lecture 16, we are going to start a new topic for this course, which is going to be the topic of unsupervised learning. Unsupervised learning is a type of machine learning that is going to be very different from all the kinds of supervised learning algorithms that we have seen so far. And this lecture will be a broad introduction to the topic of unsupervised learning. So, to begin, I would like to give you a brief high-level overview of what unsupervised learning is. And I would like to start with a simple example that will introduce an unsupervised learning dataset and an unsupervised learning algorithm. So first, at a high level, unsupervised learning is different from supervised learning because it does not involve any labeled examples. In unsupervised learning, we provide the algorithm with large amounts of unlabeled data, and then we ask the algorithm to discover by itself various kinds of interesting structure in the data. These kinds of structures can involve clusters that are hidden in the data set, and I'm going to give you an example of this shortly. It can also mean outliers, so points that look unusual or different from the points that we have seen so far, or that don't seem to come from the data distribution. And it can also involve interesting, useful signal that is structurally very different from normal signal or from noise. For example, human speech that's hidden within noise, that is a useful, interesting signal that we could try to recover in a fully unsupervised way. Now, again, at a very high level, the components of an unsupervised learning problem are very similar to that of supervised learning. We always need to start with a data set, and I will define shortly what a data set here is, but we do have to start with a data set. And then we apply an unsupervised learning algorithm to this data set to obtain a model, which is going to be I'm going to call this an unsupervised model to distinguish it from the kinds of predictive models that we have seen earlier in supervised learning. But again, it is a model that describes and that reveals something interesting about the structure of the data. And we are going to see many examples of such model in this course and in this lecture as well. So to make this a little bit concrete, let's start by let's look at an example of a data set and an algorithm and see the kinds of results that they would give us. So for our unsupervised learning data set, we are going to use the iris flower data set, which we have already seen several times in the supervised learning part of the course. Here I'm going to load this data set using scikit-learn, and again, you should remember that this is a data set containing measurements for 150 flowers, and for each of them we have 4 measurements of the flower in centimeters. And this data set actually contains flowers from 3 different species, which are given here. But for the purposes of this example, we will for now discard the labels. And here I can visualize, again using scikit-learn, these flowers in 2 dimensions. So I can take two of their attributes, the sepal length and the sepal width, and I can visualize these flowers in 2 dimensions. And what's important to note here is, unlike in the earlier examples where we did this visualization, we now don't have any labels. All the points are considered equal here. So because we don't have any labels, this is a good example of an unsupervised learning data set. It only contains measurements, but we don't know what they are. We don't know anything about the real structure of the data that was taken using, that was measured separately. So this was an example of a data set. Let's now look at an example of an unsupervised learning algorithm. And as a first example, I will introduce a very, very important and popular unsupervised learning algorithm called k-means. So this algorithm is called k-means because it will try to identify k clusters in the data, where k is a value that we're going to set, that we're going to choose. And the way k-means identifies these clusters is that it returns, it searches and returns a centroid for each cluster, which is essentially the center or the mean of that cluster is going to be a point in our two-dimensional space. And depending on which centroids we find, we may discover interesting structure in this data. Let's look at an example. So first here, I'm going to load the k-means algorithm. This is the first time that we're running an unsupervised learning algorithm, but you can see that the structure here is really similar. We import the algorithm from scikit-learn, we instantiate it, and we're going to set the parameter k to 3. We're going to ask it for to find 3 clusters in the data. And I'm going to fit this to the data, and again, I will use the first 2 features. So here, this is my data set of x's, and I fit the model on this data set. And as you can see, this is an unsupervised learning algorithm because I only fit this on the x data set, on the inputs, but there are no labels that come in here anywhere in this process. And now, so I have fit the k-means on this data set, and now I can look at the clusters that it has found. Again, this is really easy to do in Python. I have these cluster centers attribute within the model that I have learned. And here I'm visualizing these centroids using these red diamonds. And you can see that the red diamonds happen to fall in these 3 areas. Here, this set of points, even just looking at it visually, we see that this looks to us like a separate cluster. It's clear that there's a clear separation with the rest of the points. And then k-means also tells us that the best location for the other 2 clusters is approximately here and here. These are the centers of the 2 clusters, of the 2 other clusters that it has found. And what is really interesting is that now if we visualize this, if we then go back and now we apply our labels to this data set, we have the following labeled examples. So now I came back to the original data set that had actual labels for these flowers, and I've applied these labels to our to this plot where each type of flower is now denoted by a separate color. And I can see that the algorithm has found in a completely unsupervised way, so without using any labels, it has found that this cluster here corresponds to the Iris setosa cluster, and then it also correctly placed these 2 red diamonds in the middle of these 2 clusters. And even though they look very similar to each other, without knowing the label, it is hard to say that there are actually 2 distinct types of flowers, and that one of them tends to be here more on the left and the other one tends to be more on the right. We don't see this at all without the labels. But unsupervised k-means has found this structure automatically without ever having access to the labels. And we can confirm that this is the correct structure of the data by now evaluating it using these labels that were hidden at training time. So this is a really interesting feature of k-means, and it just shows how interesting and useful unsupervised learning can be. And more broadly, unsupervised learning has many interesting and important applications. It is often used for visualization. For example, we may want to discover a low-dimensional, if we have high-dimensional data, we may want to project it in 2 dimensions along some kind of useful set of axes. And so we want to find the most useful dimensions along which to project our data. This is a kind of unsupervised learning problem. Or even in the earlier example, just visualizing these clusters is something that can be helpful. Another interesting application is anomaly detection. For example, if after training k-means we saw a new flower which didn't seem to belong to any of our clusters, that could tell us that this is a flower from a fourth species that we have not seen before. Or in a more applied setting, we could use this for what is called predictive maintenance in the context of operating a factory. And if we see some instruments that are behaving in a way that's different from what we expect, then we can identify them as being likely to break. And then signal denoising is another application to which I have alluded. For example, if we have human speech that's mixed with white noise, unsupervised learning methods can effectively extract this speech and they can recover the true signal effectively. Here I have a few more short examples of what unsupervised learning can do. This is another, I guess this is a combination of clustering and dimensionality reduction. What you see here is an application of unsupervised learning to the MNIST digit dataset. So here, each point in this 2D dimension corresponds to a number. And originally, each of these numbers is a 784, so it's a 28 by 28 grid of pixels, or in other words, it's a 784 dimensional vector. And we can apply unsupervised learning to project this two-dimensional space into, to project this 784 dimensional space into an informative two-dimensional space, which looks like what you see here. And now we can go back and we can color these points according to their digit. And we see that, again, in a completely unsupervised way, this algorithm has determined that here the 2s are clustered together in this part of the two-dimensional space, the 6s are here, and it has even identified more precise structure within this data set. For example, here it has discovered that 2s are actually written in two different ways. There's this kind of 2 where there's like this little loop here at near the tail, or other kinds of 2s look like the letter Z without the loop on their tail, and it has separated these two as distinct clusters. And similarly, here the 6s, some of these 6s are tilted along one diagonal. These ones are tilted along the other diagonal. We also have two types of 1s. These ones are straight. This is a set of 1 that is written in a diagonal, and this is not something that we could have known even with having the labels, but using unsupervised learning, we have discovered this just by searching for a space that the algorithm thought contained useful signal, and this is what we have discovered. This is an example of both clustering, dimensionality reduction, and visualization, and I think it's a really interesting example. Another really interesting and similar example is shown here in the context of DNA analysis. So imagine that instead of applying the earlier operation to digits, we apply it to DNA sequences. So now each of our X's, instead of being a 784 dimensional image, it's a genomic sequence which can contain hundreds of thousands to millions of measurements. So it's a very long sequence, but we apply the same kind of transformation, although this is actually a different algorithm from the one that was earlier, but it's still a dimensionality reduction procedure. And so we find an interesting two-dimensional space in which we want to represent this data. So we project, and each genomic sequence corresponds to a person, and we know the ancestry of this person. So now I have projected all of this data into a two-dimensional space, and again I can go back and I can plot the I can add with colors the true known ancestries of these individuals on this two-dimensional axis. And what I see here, and this is really fascinating, it looks exactly like the map of Europe. If you notice here, so here these points, they have a label ES. These are individuals of Spanish descent. Here in this cluster, I have individuals of, so here I have Great Britain, and IE is Ireland, so I have Irish and British in the northwest corner. In the east corner, there's Russians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, or Latvians, Finnish and Norwegian in the north. In the very south, we have Italy, we have Turkey here, that's in a corner by itself in the southeast, and it's a little bit separated from the other points. I have Greece here in blue. So essentially, without knowing anything about geography, only by looking at the unsupervised structure of genetic sequences, this algorithm has reconstructed the geographical map of Europe. So this is really fascinating, and of course it makes sense because individuals of similar ethnicities the individuals of the same ethnicities are more similar to each other than to individuals of other ethnicities, so they naturally form a cluster. And similarly, individuals that are from Southern Europe are more similar to individuals from Northern Europe. This is purely from their genes, and because they would tend to have kids with individuals that are closer to them geographically. And so if we project this in this two-dimensional graph, we recover the geographical structure of Europe, which is another fascinating application. And finally, the last interesting application of unsupervised learning that I want to show here is in the context of human faces. This is a result in deep learning from a few years ago. This is an algorithm that has looked at a large set of human faces, and it has identified. It has learned to map these faces into a low-dimensional space. And now we can perform arithmetic within that low-dimensional space. So for example, we start with an image of a smiling woman. We project it into this space. Think of it as one of these two-dimensional spaces that I showed you earlier. So we project it there, and now we take a neutral woman. We again project it, and then we take these two representations, these two low-dimensional representations, and we subtract the neutral woman from a smiling woman, and we obtain. We do that. Then we add the vector for a neutral man, and then we can generate images. So this is actually a generative model, a generative unsupervised learning model that can generate images, and that gives us the image of a smiling man. So in other words, again, without knowing anything about human faces, only looking at data, this model has learned representations for the data, which allow us to do these interesting arithmetic operations, such as smiling woman minus neutral woman plus neutral man gives us a smiling man. So these are a few examples of what unsupervised learning can do. We will focus on a number of applications in the following few lectures. We will talk about dimensionality reduction, clustering, anomaly detection, density estimation. And in the next video, I will start to define unsupervised learning a bit more formally and introduce some notation.